Дорогие коллеги, мы начинаем с вами сегодняшний семинар по цифровым гуманитарным исследованиям, на котором согласилась принять участие наша замечательная коллега из Калифорнийского университета в Лос-Анджелесе Джоанна Дрюкер, которая сейчас является профессором библиографических исследований в Департаменте информационных наук. Джоанна известна и как художница, и как исследовательница графического дизайна, типографики, экспериментальной поэзии и так далее. Надо заметить, что в гуманитарных науках, в цифровой гуманитаристике Джоанна Дрюкер известна прежде всего как один из авторов понятия Capta или капта, тех данных, которые мы собираем для гуманитарных исследований. Помимо этого, Джоанна была соавтором книги Digital Humanities, которая вышла в Массачусетском технологическом институте в 2012 году. И помимо этого, совсем недавно вышли две очень важные книги: Visualizations and Interpretation, Humanistic Approach to Display, и в Routledge была издана книга The Digital Humanities Coursebook, An Introduction to Digital Methods for Research and Scholarship. So, dear Joanna, thank you very much for accepting to talk with us on very important issue on Capta, and it's very important to have connections with DH communities in these difficult times. We are very happy to have you here, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you all for being here. I think we all know that these are deeply distressing times, and Andre and I decided we would go ahead in any case because keeping intellectual connections alive feels very precious and very important. So thank you for having me. We decided I would revisit some of the things that have occurred in digital humanities since the publication of my paper on Capta, which was in 2011. And so I thought first I would a little bit set the stage for why I wrote that paper and where we were in digital humanities in the early 2000s, and then think a bit about the sort of larger historical context within which we absorbed tools in digital humanities that came out of multiple disciplines. And then in the last third of my talk, I will talk a bit about the developments that have occurred since 2011, in particular, things that have to do with feminism and queer theory and critical race theory, and how those have transformed our engagement with data practices as well. So there's basically three parts to this talk, and it begins here with digital humanities in the early part of the in the early 21st century. When I got to the University of Virginia in 1999, digital humanities was beginning to really come into form. It had, as I said, been building on many prior disciplines and areas of knowledge. But the notion that that we could migrate materials, archival materials, textual materials, and visual materials into digital formats and work with them introduced a whole new set of intellectual challenges for humanists. And those challenges were not merely technical, wasn't only the question of how to build platforms and systems, but they were intellectual challenges. How do we think in a digital environment, and what does it require of humanists? So here you see a page from the Homer multitext, one of the pioneering projects of the period, beautifully done. Again, all of the available witnesses for Homer and transcriptions, and connections that could be made among resources and references. Here you see the Perseus project, where again, an original text has been transcribed, and next to it are all of these various references linked and hyperlinked, and all kinds of navigation and information that structured the environment in which a literary text could be studied. Now, this doesn't seem at all, sort of challenging now, but at the time, to conceptualize what it meant to bring all of these elements together in a way that was legible, usable, and navigable meant thinking very differently from the way that traditional textual editing had proceeded in the humanities. And most specifically, I think that the challenge was for humanists to have to think explicitly about many things that had always been implicit. And we talked a great deal about that in the early 2000s. And that meant learning to use tools like TEI, structural markup, and again, the notion of making things explicit within what we call the plane of discourse, even though much of what we were referencing would be in the plane of reference. These were conversations that we had to kind of reflect on what was it we were doing in taking so literally what was being said in a text, rather than allowing its inferences and implications to be what we referenced. So again, this kind of discipline seemed very interesting to us intellectually in the early 2000s, and again was proceeding fairly aggressively in the period, in the best sense. It's like, oh, this is really interesting to do. It's really interesting to think this way. Now, it resulted in a certain amount of controversy as well, and a certain amount of reflection, as the kind of structured data approach to the study of literary texts introduced a kind of literalism into much of the way in which texts might be read. And this was a project on exploring erotic references and erotic suggestions in the work of Emily Dickinson. And again, you see the interface, it's very kind of, 2000s at this point. But the point is that a work like this, a task like this, a project like this, had many assumptions in it with regard to the way in which the semantic value of language could be tagged as having a single or specific meaning value to it. And of course, the concept of eroticism has historical dimensions, subjective dimensions, personal dimensions. And so this was a project that was both adventurous and particularly subject to critical, sort of reflection and to some extent attack. Whose eroticism? How do we define these things? Other projects along these lines that, again, were beginning to use natural language processing and other automated techniques for extracting information at a larger scale from texts began to be used and pressed into service. And here's a study of Shakespeare and of Romeo and Juliet, and with various kinds of discovery tools. Now, the concept of discovery is already premised on a kind of pseudo-empiricism, a sense that there is a kind of, explicit object that has a kind of self-evident identity that can be revealed or discovered through automated processes. And that is not necessarily the standpoint of everybody within the humanities. Many of us have a constructivist approach rather than an empirical mechanistic approach to the way we understand the process of engagement with texts. But nonetheless, this kind of work, offered the possibility to think differently about reading practices, and particularly reading practices at scale. And of course, the person whose work began to be, sort of almost the brand of distant reading was Franco Moretti. And in 2011, again, right around the same time that I published the Capta article, Moretti was publishing his work on Hamlet and the networks of characters within Hamlet. And this was the network diagram that was generated. He was working with Matt Jockers, and to see, oh, what are the relationships? Who is Hamlet close to in the play Hamlet? And of course, this got wildly criticized for being, completely obvious in terms of what it showed, while also being very reductive in terms of what it could not show. So the question is here, is it a problem of the tools? Are the tools insufficiently sophisticated to do the work we want them to do? Or is it a problem of the premise that the very premise of the idea that there is a kind of self-evident thing called a text, whose properties and features can be automatically extracted, might itself be a fallacy. So is it not good enough or a mistaken premise? And this is a debate that will continue to weave its way through in the next few minutes as I continue to talk. And of course, our tools got better and more complex, and we were able to process more and more information at higher levels. This is 6 degrees of Francis Bacon. And, you know, at a certain point, the question is, do the people using these tools in the humanities context have any idea what they're doing? Or are they simply using things like Gephi and, you know, network diagram productions and sending a corpus of material through and then going, oh, that's cool. But is it even cool, right? Or is it just sort of, something that appears to have meaning to it and is in fact an artifact of various kinds of display algorithms and so forth. So many things to talk about here in terms of the way in which these tools are on the one hand very powerful, and on the other hand, you know, lend themselves to a great deal of sort of deceptive presentation. Now, up until now, everything I've shown you was work that was done on textual materials, a textual corpus. But that began to change as Lev Manovich in particular, but other people as well, began to see the possibility of extracting information from visual materials and sound and multimedia and so forth. Now, the question that arises immediately here, of course, this is his Rothko project, sorted all of the paintings of Rothko, sorted according to color. The principle that's so important here is the principle of extraction and abstraction of information. So what is able to be parameterized, what is able to be quantified, and therefore what is able to be remediated using digital tools. And this raises, of course, all kinds of questions about ontology. It's like, what is the actual identity of an image, of a painting? We know, for instance, that these are not Rothko's paintings. These are digitally remediated images, may or may not have been color checked. What about scale, size, all kinds of factors. So again, the digital environment offered many tools, but also raised many, really important intellectual questions. Another project of Manovich's, which is, a useful example because of how legible it is in terms of its process, is the manga project, where he took 1 million manga images and then sorted them according to various features. And again, the question of the features is really interesting here because he established various kinds of statistical averages and then looked at deviation from them. Oh, statistics, that's the first time you've heard me say that word. So the question of how humanists are going to use statistics, and again, the outcome of this, the manga universe, the 1 million pages of manga, results in something that, again, has a kind of intellectual interest to it because of the questions that it raises about how to read this, what it means, what does it tell us, what do we learn at scale that we could not learn from close reading? But on the other hand, what are the assumptions behind the way in which this particular artifact that you're seeing on the screen is itself produced? So what is mediated? What's remediated? How does that process of extraction and abstraction get produced according to terms of parameterization that then present themselves in a final image as if this is X or Y? So that's a lot of components to consider. But you've noticed I have not used the word data yet, but the word data will come up because, all of a sudden people are taking these massive amounts of, not all of a sudden, but, gradually, but in a fairly short time window, people are taking massive amounts of humanistic material, cultural material, images, documents, and records, and turning them into what is called data for the sake of automated processing through algorithms, analyses, statistical processes, and visual display. As I said to you, so that's sort of like, where were we at the point when I was considering Capta? So in a very telescoped way, I'm just going to touch on a few things that have to do with the underpinnings, intellectual underpinnings of these practices. And I think it's always good to remember that the origins of much of the way in which statistical material is worked with in the, sort of social sciences comes out of 18th century practices of what was called political arithmetic. And I bring this up, here's Playfair's image and Edward Tufte's analysis of the statistical information or the quantitative information that informs it. It's always good to remember that one of the hazards of political arithmetic was the way in which it erased the presence of human beings. It allowed a degree of abstraction to enter into the analysis such that the human cost of any kind of action was to some extent sort of shielded from view. So there's an ethos here that's worth considering in terms of how this will proceed forward. And this will be relevant in a few minutes when I get to talking about COVID and the ethics of visualization in our own moment. Again, political arithmetic was grounded in many kinds of analyses of what was going on in social and cultural circumstances, the bills of mortality. And here again, these are wonderful materials to look at for pedagogy and research, because when you read down the categories of the bills of mortality, you begin to see how that incredibly complex relationship between lived experience and the phenomena of culture get transformed into structured categories, structured data. So again, this concept of structuring data began to inform humanists who are realizing that data didn't exist, it had to be modeled. And the idea of data models then becomes a place of real intellectual discussion and engagement. So again, thinking about how this comes forward into the 20th century, we note the increasing sort of standardization and codification of these practices within sort of logical systems and proto-computer systems. In the 19th century, you have people like George Boole, whose Boolean algebra still underpins much of the logical operations of algorithmic activity, but also the use of formalized code for census activity. Again, how far are we from the human phenomena, and what does that abstraction and extraction do in terms of structuring information for the purpose of management? Now, censuses go back a long way. I'm not going to dwell on this at length, but it's just important to remember that the concept of modeling data and extracting what gets called information for other purposes continues to serve ideological interests, as it did in antiquity. This is a Roman census data structure. This is the Domesday Book put together in the 11th century. And again, all of this is management. All of this has to do with taxation. All of this has to do with a layer of administration exercising authority through a distancing mechanism that takes phenomena, turns them into structured categories of information that distances the operations of the administration from the human beings being managed. And that continues to be true. So census records are one of the great instructional instruments to look at when one is teaching data models, because the way in which they are both the same as and distant from the phenomena that they record. So the whole idea of automation and of structuring information so it could be automated leads to degrees of abstraction that are quite interesting to consider. Here again, we see the punch card. Now, most of the digital humanists that I know and worked with entered into this field after the age of the punch card, but punch cards were certainly there as both an icon and an instrument for realizing programmatic analysis of information. Again, the remediation being, striking when you look at this, because it's like you have to know how values have been assigned within this abstract system in order to make it legible to yourself and as a communication with an operating system. But the work that was going on in the humanities wasn't all quantitative and merely about the abstraction of information. It was also about engagement with text and engagement with concepts. Roberto Busa is generally seen as the kind of one of the founding figures of digital humanities. You can debate this whether you want or not, but the point is that, he had met up with, IBM, and, Thomas Watson said, we could automate this project you're doing. Now, what was the project that Busa was involved with? And I put here Origin here as a kind of, church, an early figure for thinking about the editing of the church fathers and, Christian and texts. Because again, that's kind of the figure that Busa is sort of looking to. But Busa was working with Thomas Aquinas's work. And interestingly, the term that Busa was searching in Aquinas's work is the term présence or presence. Now, you couldn't ask for a more Derridian term, presence and absence. As the thing you're searching for, you're looking for traces of presence in a text. So, and of course, the concept of presence is suffused with all kinds of multiple dimensions of meaning. But could you literally find the term presence, or did you also have to have all the cognate terms, all the associated terms? So all of a sudden, we've moved from explicit structured data to the problem of the relationship between the implied and, the automated. Now, that kind of challenge is something that could only be really met by a fairly sophisticated engagement of a large team of people. And one of the great demonstrations of this is the corpus of Karl Kraus in his publication Die Fackel. And there were 20 years, I believe, of behind the scenes work to analyze the texts of Kraus's journal, because Kraus's use of language in the 1930s, in the 19-teens, and 20s, was highly coded, so that his readers came to know that certain terms referenced certain things in the changing Austrian context that were not going to be stated explicitly. So the linguists who worked on this were historical linguists, structural linguists, understood the complexity of semantic value as changing value over time rather than explicit value attached in a single way to a single term. So again, the amount of labor, human labor involved in going through these texts, tagging them and analyzing them was essential to making a tool that could expose this kind of complexity. But that's very different from what Busa was doing in his automated activity. So the question of automation then, and the way in which it could expose various kinds of complexities across corpora, across texts, within a text, started to result in a bunch of different kinds of analytics, as well as visual modes of navigation and display. So, these tools started to be pressed into use within the digital humanities environment. So what we've seen so far then is political arithmetic, statistical analysis, quantitative analysis of social science materials, and textual analysis within corpora. But the other traditions that were informing digital humanities also drew on things like bibliography and the MARC record, the machine, readable catalog record, it's a kind of icon of bibliographical activity because it's structured metadata. Oh, metadata. Now that was a term that nobody knew, in the 1990s. And by the 2000s, digital humanists were recognizing that these structured fields of description were essential. Now this is going to be important in a minute when we come to the current debates within, critical approaches and thinking about what are those fields and what are the structured elements that enter into them. These are just touchstones for a second. Other traditions that really were essential for informing digital humanities included communication theory from an informatics point of view, Claude Shannon's mathematical theory. Again, always the revelation in the classroom to students is it doesn't matter what the content is. This is about signal processing. And it's a technical issue, it's a statistical issue, it's an issue of entropy and signals. It's like, what? You mean it doesn't have to do with what you're saying? So again, coming to terms with these kinds of issues meant that humanists were really sort of coming into a world that they had never fully encountered, exploratory data analysis. Now that doesn't sound so foreign, but I will tell you in 1977, which is right, it's like, that was like, whoa, what does that even mean? That seemed to have something to do with, just a world of, switches and interfaces and punch cards. And even the graphic, which is so lovely here, is a kind of like, oh, this is about abstraction, explicitness, and, numerical value. But of course it isn't. It's much more complicated than that. So we start to see, instead of just these technical, statistical concepts, a notion like knowledge discovery. And again, this was pretty far from the humanities in 1989, though the TEI actually is established in 1989, which is kind of interesting to think about. So knowledge discovery, the concept that you could actually mine a database for some kind of knowledge. Check out this graphic though, it's really funny. Okay. So, data so the concept of data then came to be a kind of currency within the humanities. And the idea was, oh, we were making things explicit. Oh, we were tagging things. Oh, we were doing databases. We were doing, metadata. We were doing all of this kind of structured activity and using tools and instruments that we'd never used before. So all kinds of large repositories were developed, remediated material with very elaborate description on it. We'd absorb the lessons of the library, absorb some lessons of archival studies, absorb some of the statistical processes, maybe amateurishly, maybe more sophisticatedly. But, sometime in the, 2000s, the National Endowment for the Humanities realized that a lot of material had been created, but it hadn't been fully optimized in terms of what it could expose. So the Digging into Data Challenge is a very interesting milestone in the US digital humanities, because it funded projects that went back into already produced materials to say, how can they be used? And to ask how can they be used means that there was a necessity for rethinking what the subject content of these materials might be in relationship to the models of data that had been imposed on top of them, either through TEI structured kind of analyses or through metadata. And the Proceedings of the Old Bailey is one of the great projects in this series of works. So I'm not going to dwell on it, but merely to say it intellectually introduced some really interesting points. But not everybody thought about their work as data, and that continues to be true. Many of us think about the sort of materials we work with not as data, but actually as cultural records, as cultural materials whose specificity cannot be remediated fully. This is Lisa Snyder's Chicago Columbian Exposition rendering. It's a 3D model that she's been working on for many years to remake the buildings of that exposition. But one of the things that Snyder does that's so useful in her particular interface is to include all of the materials from which she is working. And by doing this, by putting those source materials into view, she's pointing out the difference between the model and the sources we're working with and everything else that's missing. So again, this is not data. Even if her models, her 3D renderings and her models are data structures, she's pointing out the distinction between what gets done in the digital environment and what we're working with as cultural historians. And I think that's a really crucial point here. So as I come to the end of my remarks then, I want to touch just on a few things that have happened within the world of data activism. As the digital humanities began to gain traction and visibility, there were also a number of people who began to be very interested in doing work in the sort of public interest. So data activism of various kinds. And Laura Kurgan, working at Columbia University in New York, was one of those people. She's an architectural historian and city, urban historian. And she did this project called $1 Million Blocks that has to do with the relationship between the costs of incarceration and the neighborhoods from which incarcerated peoples come in areas of New York City. So it's like, well, could you use data to show something about social conditions that would make a dramatic case for the way resources are being used? So this was Kurgan's project. Now, again, the issues here are not so much to question data as they were to sort of assume that data as given could be used for various kinds of arguments that would serve a rhetorical purpose. But again, by the really around sort of the 20 teens, the whole sort of series of conversations began to emerge into really sort of mature form that had to do with critiquing data production itself. So Aristia Fotopoulou is one of the figures here: feminist activism, digital networks, between empowerment and vulnerability. And, the kind of work that she was doing was described, I'll give you a little blurb here, described in this way: how are new forms of political subject and political practice possible? Focus of critical studies for decades. This question acquires new urgency in the digital era, with its radically new possibilities for acting together. And so her work was really an interrogation of data practices, as well as an assertion of the need for certain kinds of values from queer and feminist and social critique positions to come into these practices as well. Data feminism, quite a milestone here: Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein's work, which is a feminist approach to data. And again, the concern here is to kind of pluralize and to a great extent decolonize many of the ways in which data practices have been situated culturally and institutionally. So there's an institutional critique here, there's a power critique. And the question really is there a way to rethink the tools? Is there a way to rethink the making of data? Or are we merely doing a critique of data practices? So where do we move here from critique to instrumental transformation? And that will be, in a moment, the question that I'll pose to you as I finish up. So again, critical use of data, engaged with many kinds of projects that were intended to be projects in the public interest, a kind of public humanities activity. How can we use data to show something about cultural practices? But also, how can we use these visualizations and analyses to show something about data and how data is being produced and where the biases exist within data itself? Sarah Williams' work, Data Action, this is data for the public good. Again, this started to be has become a very developed field within at least the American environment and American humanities. But we still go back to the question of how do we consider tools for rethinking the way in which data itself is abstracted and extracted, and where are the critical points of intervention? So we come to a project like this. This is a fantastic dashboard put together by Johns Hopkins in their resource center to look at COVID on a daily, almost minute-to-minute basis. It constantly refreshes. And, come back to political arithmetic here. We've got a dashboard that integrates data feeds from an international, perspective. But the problem is, as with all political arithmetic, it erases the human face of what is occurring. So is that a data problem, a visualization problem, a display problem, a scholarly problem, an ethical problem, or what? Kim Gallen, in her COVID Black address to this issue, decided that the only way to deal with the human costs of COVID within the Black community in the United States would be to humanize put a face on every, sort of, person who had died of COVID and been, affected by the disease. The problem is, of course, there's a kind of compassion fatigue that sets in when you have so many individuals represented at scale. But the principle was a very important principle here. And again, redefining health data. And the question is, how is the data itself being redefined? And that's where it gets really interesting, because we have to think about what is the model of data behind these, sort of visual displays and graphics. And that's, again, where the work of someone like Kim Gallen gets very interesting, because she started to interrogate the way in which self-identification as having of belonging to an ethnic group played a role in the way in which the data was modeled. So this is, again, an instrumental intervention. Just on the end here, I want to mention the work of Yanni Loukissis, All Data Are Local, because of the way in which it shifts gears from the idea that data in something like the COVID environment can be universalized and standardized, and insists on the idea that the conditions from which data are produced and emerge have to be taken into account in understanding how the data have meaning and value. So again, we come here then to the end of one or two more slides of thinking about how does the critical engagement with the sort of recognition that data structures are themselves oppressive, that algorithms and automated procedures produce biased results, how does that critique translate into instrumental transformation? What do we do with that information? So we go back to something like this data life cycle, and it's like, oh, this is how data, right? It's like, where in that process do we rethink the terms on which bias is introduced, right? That is the challenge that is posed by these projects, right? We have to change this. Data feminism, data critique, queer data, a queer interrogation of data production, that someplace in this data cycle, we need to make a transformation. And again, we think about records of various kinds. It's like, can you restructure the fields? Can you make different kinds of interrogations? Can you ask different questions as you're producing the data? Is that the answer? Well, it's certainly important. Can we, again, we think about these, interrogations of historical material, what are the models for understanding here, the documents that come out of the Italian victims of Shoah. It's like linked open data problems. There's no way to crosswalk fairly. That introduces its own bias when we try to subsume complex cultural collections into single, single systems. Again, how do we decolonize data? Is that even a concept that can be, worked with effectively? Little Sis is a project. Its title comes from being the opposite of Big Brother, and Eyes on the Ties. It looks at power relations across various kinds of social networks globally. But again, the question I would pose here, looking at this diagram, is the tools are the same. The results are the same. The visualizations are the same. How does this actually instrumentalize any kind of critique or intervention? So we have to go back then, I believe, to the basic issues of data production, statistical processes, and think about what are the models, how are they how can they be transformed? Where do the critical engagements with data modeling result in seriously different procedures, algorithms that are able to be manipulated differently, as well as forms of visual display that would expose the complexities of data modeling and statistical processes. But in the end, I come down to the fact that we can't. It's not going to happen, all right? That it's actually not possible fully to make those interventions sufficiently to make clear what is going on within these practices, because we'll come back to this, it's like, oh, we did all the sophisticated behind the scenes work and everything is, we're showing all of these prejudices and biases. you can't read that in this image. It looks just like any other data visualization. So one suggestion, this is partly tongue-in-cheek, but partly, real, is, well, maybe we should do what we do for nutrition or health, issues. We got nutrition facts, we got warnings. Look at this, warning, bad data sets, right? It's like, we do the same kind of thing. We give information about, well, what was the percentage? What was the sample size? What are the outliers? Where's the error? Why not? Why don't we have these on our visual displays? Here's our reliability rating, right? Maybe we want some kind of standardized format that allows us to think about things in these ways. But in the end, and this is my last slide, I feel like, one of the things that we do as human beings is that we're able to live with contradictions and complexity. And that one of the challenges in the current situation is not so much to think that the problems of bias and the problems of inequity and structural, distortion that are present in all data sets, all structured and quantified, parameterized information, not to think that this is a problem that can be solved in some engineering mode, but that rather it is a circumstance to which we simply need to be attentive through critical language and through discussion. Not to say that we shouldn't rethink our data models, we should. I mean, data modeling is the crucial place where we end up with Capta. But I would say that the critiques that have come out of activist communities, feminist communities, queer communities, Black communities, and so forth, are extremely useful for pushing us towards that self-conscious examination. But I think to imagine that there's a solution to be had that will solve this problem would simply replicate the kind of erasure of process that ends up putting us into, just display at the end that doesn't show the madeness of the intellectual, the madeness of the process, the madeness according to which we arrive at those final displays and structures. So rather than think it's a problem to be solved, I would say it's an opportunity to open up procedures so that they become, so that the Capta process becomes called to attention in all of these projects, rather than being, sort of concealed again behind better data practices. I put this UNESCO image up at the end just because I think the challenges that we face as we become increasingly, networked across legacy collections and cultural differences will only intensify the kinds of questions of bias, inequity, and cultural knowledge production that we have been facing as we've moved into, the digital humanities, but of course it's true for the history of humankind going back into long histories of archives and cultural records and memory. So I'll stop there and see what kind of questions folks might have.
Dear Joanna, thank you very much for your very interesting and encouraging talk. I would like to ask you a question about this relation between data as a type of formalization, where usually cultural materials resist to this formalization, yeah? And whether we can see the data as the basis for our research as just a special signal system, as you said, remembering Shannon and all that theoretical approach, or we think that it's some kind of retelling cultural materials in our new data sets.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm sure you've thought about this many times, right? Which is that the issue really is the issue of equivalence and non-equivalence, right? It's like if we make formal structures and we parameterize and we create, a secondary representation of a cultural artifact or a cultural record of some kind. And we recognize that that's what it is. It's a re-representation that by definition loses, or it's just simply different from the, sort of source material from which it's derived. As long as we keep that in view, I think, it allows us to talk about that relationship. The difficulty comes when there's a kind of assumption of equivalence between the two, right? As if data equals a phenomena. We know it doesn't, right? And I think that, one of the issues for humanists was that most humanists were not well trained in statistics. They didn't really understand, we don't really all understand what it means to have a regression, right? Or to, address outliers or p-values or probabilistic assessments. So there's a lot of processing that occurs that isn't understood by the people who are using the tools. So I think the question of the relationship has to always be kept active rather than, sort of just set aside. It's like, oh, okay, well, we just did that and now we've got this, we'll work with the results. And, we have this source text, but what happened in between? We'll just, that's just technical, right? So I think it's a matter of developing the critical capacity to keep all of that really in view. I'm not sure. It's always also has to do with what's the purpose, right? What are we working on and for what purpose? So if you want to be able to locate records within a vast corpus of records, you want to have some kind of standard vocabulary that allows you to do that. But if you're talking about resources and on the African continent being named by a mining company that's, in the United States versus the way in which those resources are being identified within a local community, then you have, to recognize that the consequences of that are enormous. And so, again, it's in what circumstances are these activities taking place, and what are the consequences of the decisions that get made? We're in a situation in the United States right now where we're watching an incredible attack on gay rights. And the state of Florida, for instance, just passed a law that you cannot, even say the word gay. You cannot talk about LGBTQ people in schools, that's considered almost, like child abuse to do this. And so it's like, okay, so if vocabulary that is structured vocabulary within a corpus becomes outlawed, then, these are very real, very real. These are things where data and consequences have real implications for people in their lives, right? So they're not just abstractions, I think.
Yeah, I see. Actually, we do teach our humanists statistical tools. They're not very happy during the teaching, but after they do understand why it's really necessary. Anastasia, please, you have a question.
Yes, I've formulated the question. So actually, this is not the question, but maybe that's kind of, I don't know, like kind of idea I would like you, Joanna, to comment on. So there have been some discussions in Russian DH community about this, how to say it, the era of the survivor when we're talking about what you call Capta. Yes. So the problem is, so for example, if you're making kind of data Capta on the modeling some cultural material from the 19th century, or maybe even 18th or whatever, you deal only with the artifacts which have survived, which you have in possession. And so, and then what are the instruments of somehow tuning this bias? Yes. What are the instruments of modeling of something that we don't actually have access to? And the second part of the question is that I think that if we turn to the digital era, we will also be challenged with this problem, because there is a lot of digital resources which do not survive at all. And actually, for example, if we study, well, we have a very, very nice group of internet field researchers here in Russia who go to different regions of Russia and try to somehow find some old resources which were on, on local internet, on resources of the 90s. And they collect the first websites of the 90s. It's really like archaeology now.
Right.
So yes, this is very, very interesting. But I mean that the digital era doesn't help us with this problem. So I would like just you to speak on this topic. Thank you.
Sure. Well, as you have said so eloquently, this is a problem that isn't just a digital problem, but, we deal with history based on the partial record. And, therefore we construct our understanding of the past based on this. And the further back you go, the more complicated it gets, So, we think about, well, what were cave paintings? It's like, well, were cave paintings, sort of just, the only paintings that were being done? Or of course not. There were paintings on all kinds of surfaces that have disappeared and so forth. So, the problem of the partial record, I think, is never going to go away. But when I was first introduced to the work that Marian Dork, a data visualization and, the digital humanist was doing in Potsdam at his urban complexity lab, one of the things that was interesting is they were creating some visualization tools to try to show what they speculated was the full corpus and what they had to work with. So in other words, indicating to some extent, what percentage, speculating a bit on what percentage of the record is actually being is actually still available, at least introduced again that sense of the ghost, of the absent, of the missing, right? And this is sort of where I go back to my nutrition labels. It's sort of like, can we at least sort of give some indicator that, we only have 2% of such and such, and we don't really know what's missing because we never know what, it's very hard to calculate what's missing. That's why I love I love my astrophysicist friends who are always calculating, how much dark matter there is in the universe. It's like, how can you calculate that by definition? But the dark matter of humanistic work is also very real, right? And so I think there are ways that we could speculate statistically on the amount of missing matter there is and show something. It's also about the claims we make, don't you think? I mean, it's one thing when you read something and say, here's how I can read this. And it's another thing when you read it and say, this is, a statement about X. So I think it's a matter of reservation and qualification as well. I don't know. I mean, do you have any thoughts on how to approach this problem?
No, I mean, I don't have a playbook. I have just the kind of some heuristics in different cases, but actually, well, I think that's kind of intellectual challenging problem, and it is more obvious when we deal with data, not just with descriptions of what is. Well, I mean,
right.
That was a very, very good example of this cave paintings, because, well, for many years archaeologists just tried to kind of descript what is written there. But then, if we make some, I don't know, digital visualizations and tried somehow to cluster what we have and try to make some objectively seen seen statements of, I don't know, of different specific pictures, which paintings, which are how are they correspond to different, I don't know, geographical place. Then the problem is that it can make a very beautiful work, which will be very interesting to read, but actually the data, and it can be absolutely brilliant statistically made, but we have all this dark, you know, which influences our results. And I really don't have feeling that this problem is articulated very explicitly in the community. So that because it is like a little bit suicidal, yes, for us, but maybe we should not have fear, and we should somehow find at least rhetorically how to deal with that.
Right. No, I think you're right. It is. I think the term rhetorical is crucial here. Again, what are the arguments we're making based on these, you know, series of steps that start with records, phenomena, experience, and then go through various levels of mediation and remediation into structured, formalized form, you know, information that then get processed again and analyzed. So that's where, again, I know I meant it partly as a joke, but my little nutrition, you know, it's like, how many steps did it go through? What were the originals? What were the process of remediation? In other words, some kind of formalized documentation standard that actually acknowledges the series of procedures that we go through, rather than simply erasing all of that and saying, well, here's my results. It's we need to emphasize that documentation. And that's why really some little reliability index, you know, some kind of format. I'm partly joking and I'm partly serious, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. When I try to explain Capta to my students, I usually use archaeological example, because we do understand that what we have from excavations this year usually are not the last objects we do have, but
right.
How we are collecting them, it's also very important. And I have a question on visualization. You wrote much on that. How do you think, to what extent we depend in collecting data on our idea? How can we display that at the end? I mean, whether we think about what to choose as our data for collecting, what would be easier to visualize or more interesting to display. You mentioned Tufte in your talk, and I remember here's how it's called data ink ratio. So how dense you should be when you try to present your data. And I think that probably in today's, especially when we use different digital tools world, it's important to think what would be at the end of our research, how we can display that. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because again, I think, you know, the ways that we think are so structured by form, and yet we don't necessarily see that. And, you know, there's the famous essay by Nietzsche about the school essay and the way that the school essay shaped German philosophy. And he said, you know, this is a disaster because all German philosophers think in the format of the school essay because that's how they were trained. And so, you know, it's a great example, because you think about, well, okay, if you're creating, you know, data, are you thinking, you know, in terms of, you know, the comparison of values, rate of change over time, you know, percentage of the whole. In other words, the tools that we have for doing display are already in some sense informing the way you make the Capta, right? The way you model the data into some kind of form. And so again, you know, it's, you know, breaking from these forms is difficult. Do we need to break from them, or do we need to be, again, self-conscious about how they form, display, and therefore imply certain kinds of arguments, or even structure certain kinds of arguments in graphical form. So again, it's back to a rhetorical problem, which is, are we saying that the visualization is X, or are we saying the visualization does certain things to allow us to see certain things? So it's that question of breaking the equivalence, between the representation and the whole series of processes that got erased by the time we get to visualization. I mean, people just look at visualizations and think they're self-evident statements of fact. We know that's not true. Even the most sophisticated humanists will do this. It's sort of like, well, it's okay, a few things happened along the way. But these are problems of epistemology that are bound up with problems of process, visualization, form, and technique. Vico famously said, knowledge is very much made according to the forms of knowledge, forms in which we can know. So the question is, what can't we know with the tools we have? But that's why I'm saying also that, data feminism and, critical race theory, queer theory, all of these critiques are very important, but they haven't resulted in new tools. There are not new tools. The same platforms, the same techniques. There's not a feminist statistics, right? There's not a point of intervention in the construction of data itself. And why is that? Well, it's because statistical tools only operate with certain kinds of parameters. So can we really change those parameters? Maybe we can, but that's an experiment that hasn't yet fully, been executed.
So it's a kind of challenge, for us.
Yeah, exactly. Right. How do we go from critique to instrumental transformation?
Mm-hmm.
And again, lots of wonderful data activist projects. Again, I go back to someone like Laura Kurgan. These are, important projects, but they have not transformed the tools. They've merely said, I will put the tools at the service of an issue or agenda for critical purposes. And maybe that's
some other questions, please. Do we have questions from the audience? Then I will ask once more.
okay.
How do you think, what is your attitude to automation of the data analysis? Whether we can have some useful results in digital humanities, or it's just for some technical purposes as possible?
Again, I think, all of these are useful tools for doing things that we can't do in other circumstances. So, if I want to, sort of look to see how certain kinds of vocabulary change over time. So for instance, what if I decide there's an 19th century American poet, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was a giant figure in the 19th century. So if I decide that I'm interested in knowing what percentage of Walt Whitman's vocabulary matches the vocabulary in use in journalism of his day, right? To what extent is poetic language a separate language that signals to its readers to read it in a particular manner? And to what extent is poetic language really a matter of poetic form and the identity of the author and the site of publishing? So if I want to look at a question like that, and I want to run a text analysis on the vocabulary of Whitman in relation to the vocabulary of major journals in Philadelphia, Camden, and New York, where he was in those periods, I can't do that as a human being, right? I mean, it would take me several lifetimes to be able to do that. Whereas I can run a text analysis to see what, just statistically, what those differences look like. And that's a start point for certain kinds of work. So I think automation serves a real purpose at scale. But again, you need to be aware of the caveats of, you know, what's a vocabulary word, right? What is a word? A word, you know, Wittgenstein says, you know, words meaning is its use. So, you know, a word like mother can take on many, many different, you know, it can be used in a derogatory way. It can be used in a celebratory way. It can be used descriptively. So the term mother doesn't have a single value. And, you know, it's a word that's going to come up in 19th century language. So again, I'm in favor of using these tools. It's a question of how they're used.
I think it's very important to call to refine or even to change our tools for better results.
Exactly.
Yeah. Joanna, thank you so much for this encouraging talk and for your answers. For our participants, I will share your personal site so all can check your wonderful books. I think that it's good to start with the artists' books because it's important to understand the different approaches to the understanding of the world, not only as we usually do the scholar approach. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I wish all of you well in this really, really distressing time. And let's hope for resolution soon of these conflicts. So stay well.
We hope the same.
I know
Thank you
do.
very much and see you soon.
All right.
Goodbye.
Farewell.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.